His presentation topic is Flood Marr and Habitat Suitability Floodplain Restoration Opportunities, Analysis to Promote Multi-Benefit Project Implementations. And this is a collaboration between California DWR, Jacobs, and cbec. Let's welcome Michael Fownes.
All right, thanks, Camille, and great presentation. Great, that was really interesting to see. So I'm going to be presenting for our group today. This project is a collaboration, as Camille mentioned, between DWR. From DWR, we have a number of groups represented with Lori Clamurro-Chew, David Martasian, and Jenny Marr. We are also working with Jeremy Thomas and Tapash Das at Jacobs. And for cbec Eco Engineering, there is myself, Chris Bowles, Luke Tillman, and Gavin Downs. So in the interest of time, I'm going to present the results of this kind of preliminary overview of the work, but it has been a very collaborative effort. So I want to acknowledge all of these team members. So we are going to be providing an update to the Floodplain Restoration Opportunities Analysis, or FROA. What is FROA? FROA was originally developed in the 2012 Central Valley Flood Protection Plan, and it was a way to look outside of the floodplains for potential opportunities for restoration, specifically levee setbacks or topographic modification. And the original analysis was a great framework to look at the whole Central Valley and say, where are kind of areas where we could easily get inundation by either setting back levees or modification, but it had some limitations. We are going to be doing this pilot study to update the FROA analysis to consider a couple additional items. Habitat suitability for salmonids, altered hydrologic flow regimes. So we're talking about, instead of looking at a single event, looking at accumulated acre days of habitat over a water year. And this can be useful for future applications, such as looking at an alternative flow regime or climate change. And a big one that we are working on right now is how can we consider potential for flood marr and floodplain restoration projects. So we kind of arrived at this topic through some of the work on the climate TM that we have been doing in collaboration with Jacobs and DWR as well. Through that, we have been working on the Central Valley Flood Protection Plan. And through the CVFPP, there are a number of data gaps on floodplain inundation. In particular, how can we think about floodplain inundation in a future climate regime? So that's one question we want to answer. And then just as a kind of broader question, we need a systematic approach to evaluate multi-benefit floodplain restoration projects. And we want to be able to track progress towards measurable objectives for the conservation strategy and just in general to promote kind of implementation of large-scale multi-benefit projects. And since, there are a lot of pieces involved, it is useful to kind of have a process that we can apply at a system-wide scale so that not every kind of reach of the river has to do this kind of complex analysis. We want something so we can target large reaches of the river and identify great areas for potential restoration projects that might achieve a number of objectives. So these include groundwater recharge, future management scenarios, climate resilience, and salmonid habitat suitability. And this is a much needed update to the original FROA analysis that was completed before a lot of kind of scientific breakthroughs and computing breakthroughs that allow us to apply some newer and more interesting methodologies. So for the overview of this presentation, I'm going to first kind of give a broad description of the flood marr and CVFPP programs that are supporting us, what the relationship is to this project. And then we're going to dive into an overview of the EcoFit project. And this is kind of a snapshot of what we are working on now. We are a couple months into the technical analysis, so there will be much more to come as we continue to make progress and develop these tools. So I'm sure everyone is familiar with flood marr, so a water resource management strategy using high flows that we can promote on agricultural lands and working landscapes. And a lot of times the context that flood marr has come up with at FMA and in other venues is on agricultural fields. So it's using conveyance from rivers to transport water to agricultural fields for recharge. What we're going to be looking at that's a little bit different in this study is how we can use our existing floodplains in the natural conveyance of rivers to get water to areas of the floodplain that we might be able to use to actually obtain a lot of recharge. And we're going to work on quantifying that in a really interesting way. So why flood Marr? And, you know, everyone knows that California is a climate of extremes. We go from periods of drought to periods of floods. Right now, it's incredibly dry, and that probably means that it's a great time to be planning for the next flood. This is only going to be exacerbated by climate change. In our study, pilot area is actually going to be in the San Joaquin River, the upper San Joaquin, where we're seeing some really dramatic impacts, potential impacts from climate change. And that system is potentially going to see some, we'll see very large increases in the projected level of flooding. So with the Flood Marr program, they have done a great job gathering scientists that represent a number of entities to develop the research advisory committee to guide Flood Marr and bring it towards kind of implementation. So they developed a Flood Marr research and data development plan to identify the research priorities to support Flood Marr. And of those, there are a couple that are really relevant to this project. So specifically, establish direct methods and considerations by which floodplains can be used as direct recharge sites, and develop a tool to calculate groundwater recharge that occurs when floodplains are inundated. And we're gonna show you some of that work in this study. We are also working with a group from the Central Valley Flood Protection Plan through DWR. The Central Valley Flood Protection Plan was based on this 2008 Central Valley Flood Protection Act, which mandated a plan that would be updated every 5 years. And the most recent plan is being updated for 2022 right now. And while a lot of the plan focuses on flood protection, there are all of these additional objectives. So promoting natural hydrologic and geomorphic processes, improving the diversity and connectivity of riparian species. So there's a big question of how we can quantify these things. And as we develop methods for tracking our effectiveness and planning towards implementation of outcomes, DWR has a high-level goal of system sustainability. And through sustainability, we are not just thinking about the flood management concerns, we are thinking about, well, public health and safety, ecosystem vitality, a healthy economy, and enriching experiences. So our project is primarily going to be targeting this ecosystem vitality. How can we promote natural geomorphic processes? And this project is a collaboration with a number of groups, both through Jacob, cbec, and DWR, but also within DWR. So we're working with groups from the Central Valley Flood Protection Plan, this Division of Multi-Benefit Projects, and Flood Marr. And we have some of them here to actually answer questions today. So if you have any questions for David or Lori or Jenny Marr, please put them in the chat and they will be able to respond to them at the end of this presentation. So with that background, I'm going to jump into the kind of overview of this project. And there are a lot of details that we could potentially go into. I'm going to keep it high level for now, but I strongly encourage if anyone has any technical questions or is curious about a specific analysis that we are working on, feel free to reach out to myself or one of the project members on our team. Our emails will be at the end of this project. So the original FRO analysis was developed in the 2012 CVFPP, and it used these GIS-based products and HEC-RAS 1D hydraulic model outputs to look at water surface elevations and project those outwards to identify areas that could potentially be inundated. This was done within a 2-mile wide corridor beyond the levees. And this analysis focused on a number of specific flows, such as the frequently activated flow, which is an event that occurs in every two out of every 3 years during the springtime, and inundates the area to 1 foot. However, when we're thinking about climate change or a future management scenario, we want to think about what a full water year range of flows would look like for a system. So we're going to update the floodplain inundation potential analysis to become ECOFIP, the ecological floodplain inundation potential. And we are adding methodologies to look at habitat suitability and floodplain recharge. Part of this analysis is going to focus on habitat suitability and the optimal level of analysis that's useful to apply at a systematic scale. So the way this works is we've set up 3 tiers of analysis that are increasingly complicated. The first is a replication of the original 2012 analysis, only looking at the connected and disconnected areas for specific flows. The second level looks at an entire water year and accumulates acre days of suitable habitat and inundated acre days of habitat on the floodplain. The third tier of analysis is something that Greg actually mentioned in his presentation, which is a more complex habitat suitability analysis that thinks about the temporal component, and it is similar to the habitat quantification tool that Alice and Whipple developed. And part of the goal of this effort is to compare these tiers of analysis so we can understand how they might relate on the river ridge scale and how the different tiers of analysis can be useful. The other kind of large problem that we are trying to solve is how do we predict the flux of water moving from the floodplain down through the beta zone to the subsurface? And this is something that is not done in a lot of studies, because when we get water out on the floodplain, it can be for only a short duration, maybe only a couple of days. And we have this question of what exactly does the surface look like, and how do we represent the complex physics to have water flow through the floodplain to the beta zone? So we're going to actually predict quantitative estimates for representative soil profiles of how water moves through the beta zone. And this is going to allow us to compare recharge estimates that we would get from the floodplain to any other way that you're trying to promote flood Marr or get some type of recharge benefit. So digging into a couple of the details is when we're looking at water in the floodplain, it's rare to see a model that evaluates floodplain infiltration on a small enough time scale to be effective to represent floodplain inundation events. We're also looking at areas outside of the levied extent, so they're not covered within an existing groundwater model. And this is kind of fundamental research that we need for restoration planning. We need to consider how long do we want to inundate floodplains, and what kind of recharge rates are we going to get if we inundate floodplains for different durations, different ponded depths. How do we want to configure our future restoration projects to work well from a recharge standpoint? And we're going to use a 2D hydrous model to evaluate this. Digging in a little further, this is a setup of a representative example of a floodplain. And on the right, we have a channel, and then we have a number of soil layers, which we would parameterize by either soils information near the surface or drillers logs deeper down into the soil. And just note there's a restrictive layer where we have the clay loam down below the soil, and we're going to look at how that affects the water flow. So the first one we're looking at is the timer is on the right, and we're seeing as we get to day 2, we have our floodplain inundation event, and we're going to have water on the floodplain for 3 days. And we can see how that water moves through the profile, hits the restrictive layer, and then moves much slower. We can also evaluate this in terms of pressure head, which is another way to look at the soil. And we can include other simultaneous physical processes that are really important, like root water uptake, right? Do we know if the water is getting past the restrictive layer, or is it going to be evaporated back up into the atmosphere by the plants that are out on the floodplain? And we're going to use this modeling tool to answer some of these questions and come up with a representative recharge rate. So ultimately, what we want to get to is a velocity of water moving through the floodplain that's shown at the top. And what we can see is on the left, we see very quick infiltration for the first couple of days. But once it hits that restrictive layer, we get that example at day 10 where we have very slow infiltration. So we can use these types of analyses to understand how water moves through the soil profile to a depth of 30 feet and get a representative recharge rate for a realistic floodplain inundation event. So how do we connect the information in these soil profiles to a larger spatial scale? That's an incredibly complex question that, we know we're not going to get a perfect answer, and you're never going to represent the exact conditions you would see at the field, but we want to generate what is a useful scenario to evaluate recharge. So one of the things we're doing, and this is brand new, is we're looking at drillers logs and the texture from different drillers logs and relating them to soil layers that we see at the surface, such as the hydrologic soil group shown on the right. And what we can do is establish some basic relationships between how we see the soil hydrologic group and the texture at both the surface and deeper within the soil. And if we think we see a relationship between
habitat quantifications.
On the left, we see very quick infiltration for the first couple of days. But once it hits that restrictive layer, we get that example at day 10 where we have very slow infiltration. So we can use these types of analyses to understand how water moves through the soil profile to a depth of 30 feet and get a representative recharge rate for realistic floodplain inundation event. So how do we connect the information in these soil profiles to a larger spatial scale? That's an incredibly complex question that, we know we're not going to get a perfect answer, and you're never going to represent the exact conditions you would see at the field, but we want to generate what is a useful scenario to evaluate recharge. So one of the things we're doing, and this is brand new, is we're looking at drillers' logs and the texture from different drillers' logs and relating them to soil layers that we see at the surface, such as the hydrologic soil group shown on the right. And what we can do is establish some basic relationships between how we see the soil hydrologic group and the texture at both the surface and deeper within the soil. And if we think we see a relationship between sand and clay here, we can use this to inform how we develop our representative soil profiles. Ultimately, what we want to do is run these two-dimensional Vadosome models to come up with recharge rates for realistic floodplain inundation events that we can look at that are representative for kind of wide areas. And of course, there is a lot of uncertainty in this analysis, but we think this will be really useful to actually put numbers on recharge rates instead of kind of only looking at relative recharge potential. And now we're going to dive into our study area. So we are applying this pilot study to the upper San Joaquin River, from the Friant Dam down to the Chowchilla bifurcation, which is near Firebaugh, California. And what we have up on the map is the height above river analysis, which is one of the preliminary inputs to the tier 1 of our analysis. And this is created by looking at the water surface elevation within the hydraulic model and projecting that outwards for a particular flow to look at how high the surrounding floodplain is relative to the river. And what this is going to allow us to do is kind of very quickly evaluate where are some of our opportunities for restoration. Usually these are going to be where the height above river is negative in this example in these purple and blue areas, whereas in the kind of black area, we have the floodplain much higher relative to the river, and it would be hard to connect those areas of floodplain with kind of reasonable modifications such as levee setbacks or topographic modification. Looking at the same reach of river, we're able to actually kind of fly over this zone, and we can see that towards the bottom area that we were just looking at, that it was well connected. We can see that the floodplain is a similar elevation to the river. And then as we scroll up, and we don't have too much time to look at this, but as we get higher up, we see that the river becomes a little bit more channelized and there's less immediate opportunities for restoration. And as we get to the top section of this area, we get into these older gravel pits where there may be some more limited opportunities within this river corridor. And then eventually we get all the way up to Friant Dam. So that is an important thing to think about in this system, is that the hydrology is going to be controlled by this dam upstream. So now I'm going to give a quick example of some of the outputs for this analysis from the tier 1 to tier 2 to tier 3. Right now we are working on tier 1 and tier 2 of the analysis, and then eventually we will be getting to tier 3. So our modeling framework is, a simple way of putting it is we are taking surface hydraulic modeling outputs based on the Central Valley Flood Protection 2017 hydraulic model, and integrating those with Vadosome modeling from the Hydrus 2D examples that I was showing. We're using these to inform our tiers of analysis for floodplain inundation and habitat suitability. So for our tier 1 analysis, we evaluate some specific flows. So the frequently activated flow that happens for a week every 2 to 3 years, it's at an elevation, or it's at a flow of 400 CFS. So we simply map that for connected and disconnected areas. And within those areas, we could also evaluate a recharge rate for that same inundation event. So we would model a 7-day inundation event to represent a recharge rate for that particular flow on the floodplain. But unfortunately, the hydrology is much more complex, and there is a relationship between what the dam releases and the duration of flows that you get every year. So these kind of higher flows that we need to actually inundate a lot of the areas of floodplain do not occur as frequently as we would like them to have a lot of rearing habitat. So instead of targeting a single specific flow, which only relates to this specific hydrograph, we want to go into this tier 2 analysis where we can evaluate flows over a whole water year. So the tier 2 analysis will evaluate the habitat suitability, looking at the combination of depth and velocity, making sure we are basically not too deep on the floodplain for salmonid habitat, and that we are inundated to a deep enough depth to have that optimal habitat out on the floodplain. And we can look at it for at the river reach scale or within a site boundary. And how we summarize this information is by the water year. We feed the actual time series of discharge through this to summarize how much habitat suitability in acre days or weighted usable area acre days we would get over a given water year. And this is looking at a small site along the river and estimating how much water we would have under existing conditions. And then we also evaluated what benefit you might get from limited excavation within this site. But that's probably for another discussion to go into that level of detail. And we will use these kind of results to pair with a recharge analysis and come up with recharge rates for these different sites. Tier 3 of this analysis is something that we haven't completed yet, but the methodology will be somewhat similar to the habitat quantification tool, which is probably the most robust tool to look at salmonid habitat quantification, but it is a little bit harder to use. It's very data intensive in what you need to input it, so you probably wouldn't be able to apply this type of tool for the entire river reach, whereas in tiers 1 and 2, we can do those at very large scales. So there's a trade-off between kind of the computational analysis you want to do and the scale that we are able to apply it. So right now we are in kind of the collaboration phase and working on some of the technical analysis. We have made a lot of kind of partnerships and talked with a lot of relevant stakeholders in the area about the type of work we are doing, because we want this to be a tool that other people can build off of and that the results can be useful to inform a lot of restoration planning. And we hope to continue to do outreach, things like FMA, to show the type of work we are doing. And we really encourage that everyone reach out to myself or Luke Tillman, who, if you have one of the really technical questions, or any of our partners at DWR, if you have a question for them as well. I also want to acknowledge all of our great partners on this project. Of course, we have DWR, Jacobs, Jeremy Thomas was really instrumental in kind of seeing the connection between EcoFIP and what it could do to solve these data gaps. And also all the people that have worked on the original FROA analysis back in 2012. We're really building off some of that original work that we have continued to be a part of over the years.